Hello, tiny people. Just a quick run through on the amendments 16 to 20, so you make sure you get everything straight here. The 16th Amendment, let's take a look at that first. That's the federal income tax. And I've told you before, when they first put a federal income tax in, it was declared unconstitutional because it's a capitation. It was a tax directly on individuals, and kind of a hangover from the Articles of Confederation government. That wasn't going to float. It says directly in the Constitution that that could not happen, that the federal government could tax people individually. So they had to go ahead, they being the members of Congress, the politicians who wanted to push this, had to make a constitutional amendment. Because it was unconstitutional to have an income tax, the only solution to get one was to change the Constitution. They did that with the 16th Amendment. And it says the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. Now, when this thing was first laid out as a plan, this amendment, one of the senators stood and said, I think we should make a limit on this. We should limit this to 3%. The original federal income tax was 1%. And he was laughed off the floor of the Senate because they said Americans would never stand to have 3% of their incomes taken by the federal government. Well, governments do like taxes. And if you take a look at the income tax schedule for the year 2020 that I've posted here, you'll notice that the lowest marginal rate is 10%. They said it would never get as high as 3%. And if you look at the top one there, it's 37%. That's kind of amazing. So anyway, it became the law, and we are allowed to have an income tax now. The 17th Amendment was senators were elected directly by the people. Originally, what the Constitution said was that people would elect a state legislature. In Wisconsin, we have an assembly and a Senate in Madison. And that those people would choose the two United States senators from Wisconsin. Now, as it is, there was a big movement in the early 1900s, and the 17th Amendment was ratified in 1913 to give more power directly to the people. So this was adopted where people vote and elect the senators themselves without the need to go through the state legislature. The 18th Amendment was prohibition, and this was ratified in 1919. Now, prohibition means they forbid the sale, importation, exportation, manufacture of intoxicating liquors, of booze, beer, and right down to the hardest stuff. I'm going to read it to you. You should mark the whole thing. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within, the importation thereof into, or exportation thereof from the United States, and all territories subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. So that ended beer. And what started this call? It was actually World War I. See, before World War I, most of the people that lived in the United States lived in rural communities, pretty close-knit, near family, and they didn't get very wild for the most part. They worked awfully hard. Well, in World War I, the United States, when we entered, sent a 1,000,000-man expeditionary force. We sent 1,000,000 soldiers over to France to help fight against the Germans. And those 1,000,000 men were taken an awful lot from those small farms and rural communities. And when they went over to Europe, there's intense scares and emotion in a battle, but most of the things soldiers do is not battles. Most of what they do is wait, and there's intense boredom. And then they're young men. All those things together can lead to drinking. And Europe was a little more liberal with the alcohol use than the United States was at the time. And so lots of them became serious drinkers. When they came back home, there was a big movement because they thought we need a more moral America. We have to get rid of this nasty alcohol. And so they passed prohibition. The problem with that was there were an awful lot of people, a large number of Americans who said, look, it's not the government's business whether or not we want to have a beer after work. So they didn't really obey the law. I think you can see this sometimes when you drive on a road and the speed limit might say 25 miles an hour and everybody on the road is driving 35. They simply have said, well, we don't choose to obey that law. Are they breaking the law? Absolutely. Are they doing something illegal? Absolutely. Do they think they're doing something wrong? Probably not, or they wouldn't do it. Same was true for a lot of people that wanted to resist prohibition. Unfortunately, there were some rather bad people who saw a way to make a profit. The guy on your right there is Al Capone, who decided, crime is a business. What we need to do is organize crime. And so from his offices in Chicago, he managed to build quite an empire of crime, selling primarily bootlegging at the beginning. And that was making illegal liquor, beer up to the hard stuff. And he made lots and lots of money and corrupted the government in lots of levels by buying judges and police and such. So what happened was America ended up with a much less moral place than they had hoped for. If you ever get to Chicago, you can take the Chicago Gangster Tour, which is really fascinating, and see some of those places where the violence broke up. Some of those big cities were almost like war zones, with the gangsters fighting between themselves and with law enforcement. It was not a good time. The 19th Amendment is women's suffrage. It says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. When it says women's suffrage, doesn't mean that people suffer because women are there or women suffer. Suffrage means to suffer something means to allow it, to let it happen. And what they were looking for was they were looking for women to have the right to vote, to finally have an equal say in governing America and choosing its leaders. So women's suffrage in 1920 made that legal across the United States for federal elections, that women would have the right to vote. And it also included state elections. The 20th Amendment. This you can read through, and Section 1 marked the first 3 lines, Section 2 marked the whole thing. It used to be, when the country started, that when someone was elected president or into Congress, they would have to get on a horse and pack up their belongings in a wagon, and they would have to take a long time to move their way across dirt roads up to Washington, D.C. But this is 1933 when the 20th Amendment was ratified, and at that point in time, people could hop on an airplane. They could put their goods in a truck and bring them up to Washington. A lame duck is a politician who is still in office, but because of the results of an election, will not be there much longer. They've already lost an election or have resigned to somebody, or have decided not to run and someone else has been elected. Now, it's called a lame duck because they're still in office, but they don't have the same power. They don't have the same persuasion or ability to persuade as do politicians who are in for a long time. Suppose that Governor Ebers, the governor of Wisconsin, that he in the next election is defeated for the governorship. Well, that election would happen in November and the swearing in of the governor would happen in January. So for November, December, and most of January, the governor would still be in office, but no one would really care what he had to say because they know he's not going to be leading the state for years to come. It's going to be the person that had won the election. And this is important. I use the example of a governor there because most people would say, oh, you must mean the president. And it's true of the president. It's true of congressmen, senators. It's true of all of elected officials, in any elected official, in any capacity, state, local, federal, it doesn't matter. A lame duck, just any politician who, because of an election, won't be in office much longer, but is still there at the time. All right, tiny people, that takes care of amendments 16 to 20. We're going to move the TIS on the amendments over to Tuesday because on Monday we are having the ERBs, so there won't be a class that day. Also, let's see here. I know that we've got a couple of bankers out, and bankers, your banks will be audited. I'll just have done the work for you. If you weren't here on banking day, you'll still be paid. One of the benefits of working for the bank. Let's see, what else have I got here? Candidate for office applications. You need to be in by 3:15 on Friday. So if you are listening to this at home and you want to run for office, get me a candidate for office application. Just let me know section and district, and that you want to run for office. And it's only the House of Representatives. They're the only person that go for reelection. If you are already in the House, you still need to send me a notice that you wish to run. Send that via email to me, jim.homan@brookfieldacademy.org. All right, tiny people, have a good day.